All right, I think I'm actually going to start over again because I'm not sure how much of that was heard. Uh, so sorry for that. Again, this is Jay Doran with the Legal Foundation of Washington and co-chair of the Access to Justice Board's Communications Committee. Thanks for your time today. This is the first of a quarterly webinar series that the Access to Justice Board Communications Committee is putting on this year. We've termed the webinar series ACT webinar series, ACT standing for Alliance Communications Toolkit. So we have, through a series of surveys and conversations with providers around the state, kind of taken a list and inventory of communications needs and have now compiled uh, quarterly webinars this year to try and address some of those needs that programs have identified. Um, so again, thanks for your time. We'll send out an email after this, but just so you know, the next webinar is on May 23rd, and it's called How to Effectively Share Client Stories. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Soren from Voices for Civil Justice, and I just want to say thanks to Soren and to Voices for helping out and working with us in the first webinar. And Soren will not only be presenting, but he'll start off with some housekeeping issues so people can know how to best participate. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Jay. And hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I want to thank the Access to Justice Committee, Communications Committee, for putting this together and for having me here this afternoon. Yeah, I'll start with a few housekeeping rules, and they are that the slides will be made available after the session, and the messaging we will go through will also be made available after the webinar, so no need to take notes unless you learn the best that way. Um, I encourage you to post questions and comments along the way in the chat box. I left a decent time of for questions at the end of the presentation, and if there's something that will be answered later, please forgive me if I say that will be answered later and move on. So again, the best way to probably do questions and comments along the way is in the chat box. And I just wanted to quickly check if that works for everybody or if everybody sees that. So if you see that, could you please write me a quick note with your name and how the weather is where you're at right now? Okay, I don't see anything here. Unless people are just being a bit shy about it. Okay, at any rate, let's go ahead and get moving in this. And if you have any questions, just to make sure if you have any questions along the way, you can definitely start by raising a hand, and that should be available to you on the right-hand side as well. So just a very, I guess, to start with a few things about me. My name is Soren. I am a Danish citizen, but I have always been into America, as you can see from this very early age. And yeah, please don't hold the Michigan thing against me. That's definitely my parents. But I came here 3 years ago, and I had no clue what legal aid was and what civil legal aid meant, and kind of the incredible, as I've come to learn, incredible work that's being done around the country. What I do have come to believe is that this is probably the single most important thing that isn't being talked about in terms of the larger societal issue, both in terms of the crisis in the civil justice system and just the lack of availability of legal help and legal aid in general. So I'm thrilled to be here to be able to share, hopefully, my small contribution to get everybody on the same page and talking more about this vital issue. today we'll do three things. We'll talk about what we have deemed the most important and vital principles in communications. We'll talk about the challenges in civil legal aid messaging in general, and then we'll dive into the messaging research that we have done recently last year, and we'll go into a few examples of how you can apply it and how that kind of translates into how that you can use that to address the challenges that we're going to talk about and how you can adhere to those principles of communication. But let me first take a step back. This argument is that there's a question, why should we communicate at all? And I know that at least in some parts of the country, and we've had this hesitation when working with attorneys in general or other advocates, is that, they're very humble. There's definitely a reticence, to some people at least, to jump in and talk about their issues or advocates on their own behalf. And I know for LSC funded programs, there's definitely that restriction too, in terms of what you can and cannot say. I assume that since you're here on this webinar, you already are there and you want to communicate better. But I just wanted to make this point that this will happen. People will talk no matter what, and you are much better equipped if you work on shaping the message instead of reacting to it. And I used to work on do a brief stint on a political campaign where all the volunteers would talk all the time about what the latest poll was saying, and kind of being worrying about that. And our counter response would always be, do you want to follow the polls or do you want to shape the polls? And this is the kind of the analogy here is, of course, you can sit back and watch the discussion happen and have other people kind of shape and create that conversation. And if you're not going to be a part of it, there's no reason to think that it's going to change. So I recognize some of the people on the just from the names of the attendee list, but I'm just really curious about how many of you like necessarily know about voices. So I've just created this short poll here for a second, if you don't mind just taking that. Okay, I see everybody is tuned in. Okay, well, that is certainly a fair balance of people who are on the webinar. Thank you for doing that. And for those who haven't heard about Voices before, briefly what we do is we help legal aid organizations across the country, mainly on communication skills. We also help do media as a tactic to both raise awareness, but more importantly, to try to build political support and support for funding. And we do this mainly in national media, but we certainly help on a local level as well. One of the ways that we have worked with you all in Washington, and that we've been working with the EJC for a while, is around the funding campaign. So the material that some of you may have been seeing, that's on the right there, we helped out with that. The op-ed that was authored by Rob McKenna, we provided some feedback on that as well, and just in general help with media placements. And that's the sort of thing we're a nonprofit. Our service doesn't cost anything. So if afterwards you want to be connected with us, or just need help with any type of, excuse me, there we go. These are the types of things we've been working on with you along the way. As you can see on the right here, the we've been working with some material related to the funding campaign, and I apologize for not being able to hide the results there for a second. But these are the types of things we've been working on in Washington State. And if you want to connect with us in any sort of sense, we have this listserv, and you can join through this link. And this link will, I will put up this link at the end of the presentation as well. But I just want you to know that there are ways that you can sign up and get in touch. Okay, let's dive into the first part of the sessions, and it is what the vital principles of communications are. So the first thing is really to consider who your audience is going to be. And you're not going to talk to a conservative legislator from Spokane in the same way you're going to talk to the mayor of Seattle or each of those respective constituencies. That's something that's, kind of to always consider. When people come to us and ask, what is the best message in general to use? We have some ideas as it relates to voters in general. But the more important thing is always to start by saying, oh, well, who is your audience for this? And the reason that is because you want to start by connecting over values. And I just want to show you this really cute example from this woman here, Catherine Hayhoe. She's an evangelic climate scientist that you can see. And I want to quickly play you a clip about how she has described her work and how she is trying to persuade climate skeptics.
Now, you're known for being a kind of master communicator when it comes to getting Christians, devout Christians, to adopt the fight against climate change. How are you going about putting that message in front of people? What is your approach, your tactics?
The way I talk about this issue is the first thing I do is not pulling out the science, not, getting all the data out and just saying, look, here's the data, and if you don't agree with it, you're an idiot. That is the absolute worst thing that we can do in any argument, really.
Why is that? That was you said that's the Al Gore approach. Here are my slides. Here's the fact-based evidence. Why is that a bad approach?
It works if we're already convinced of the reality of the issue and we want the information to inform our decisions over how concerned we need to be and what we can do about it.
Right.
Whereas if we're talking to people who are very genuinely skeptical, or if they're, I think doubtful is a better word, in talking to them, the first thing I do is I start by connecting over a value or a concern that we already share.
So she is a good explainer in terms of how she's thinking about audiences, but she also goes into what is the second core messaging principle, and that's the thing she talks about there. It is leading with shared values. And the idea behind that is that if you present people with a shared value that they can agree on to start, and then explain the problem to them, those two things that will create a cognitive dissonance that people come to see this problem as an immediate threat to that certain value. And just to give you a sense of why you should lead with a shared value, I want to play you two video clips, and they're both from the same speaker. It is Brian Stevenson, who is the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative and author of Just Mercy. Some of you may already been familiar with him. He's a very compelling advocate against the death penalty. In these two short clips, you'll see him bring up issues in two very different ways. And the first thing is where he talks about the facts first. And I apologize for the video being a bit spotty. That's when we were broadcasting over webinar. And here's Brian talking and starting the conversation like this.
In the United States, we are struggling with capital punishment and its implementation. A short, quick legal history. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court struck down the death penalty after recognizing that it was being applied in an arbitrary manner. The court in 72 noted that 87% of the people executed for the crime of rape were black men convicted of raping white women. 100% of the people executed in the United States between 1930 and 1972 for the crime of rape were executed for offenses involving victims who were white, even though it was believed that women of color were 3 times as likely to be the victims of sexual assault.
Now, there are a lot of numbers and a lot of statistics in this, and I have done this exercise a couple of times, and it's not to try to, I'm not trying to trick you here in any way. I just wanted to show you another way of leading this conversation.
I was giving this lecture in Germany, some lectures in Germany about the death penalty. It was fascinating because one of the scholars stood up after the presentation and said, well, it's deeply troubling to hear what you're talking about. So when we don't have the death penalty in Germany, of course, we can never have the death penalty in Germany. And the room got very quiet, and this woman said, there's no way with our history we can ever engage in the systematic killing of human beings. It would be unconscionable for us to, in an intentional, deliberate way, set about executing people. And I thought about that. What would it feel like to be living in a world where the nation state of Germany was executing people, especially if they were disproportionately Jewish? I couldn't bear it. It would be unconscionable. And yet in this country, in the states of the Old South, we execute people. We're 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is black, 22 times more likely to get it if the defendant is black.
So, as I mentioned, I've done this exercise a couple of times. I did it when I was training in Washington at your Access to Justice conference last year. And one of the things that always comes up is, which one of these two do you think is the more likely that people will remember when they walk away, or when they go home, that they, like the day after the presentation, or even a week after the presentation, or a month after the presentation? It's probably not going to be all the numbers, even though there of course are staggering and in itself. It's more likely to be that story that he starts with, and that kind of shared value of what is conscionable and what is not conscionable. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is telling a systemic story. And this is particularly important because there are two different kinds of mindsets that people have at the same time, especially as it relates to poverty or poor people, but in general, it is something that all of us hold at the same time. And the first one is that there's this sense of individual responsibility, and the world is defined by our own actions. At the same time, people also have this idea of shared responsibility, and that the circumstances dictate many ways in which human beings behave, and it dictates the way we think about how people end up in poverty, or why they are in poverty in general, experience of poverty in general. And we want to tap into the sense of the shared responsibility and the systemic reasons for why people are facing hardships in general. So, what does that look like? I want to play a short video clip, and it's about a community in Chicago that have a lot of people who don't eat really well, and you can imagine, or where they face like issues related to public health and unhealthy diets in general. And you can probably imagine how this story could be told. It could be told as a story of how people are lazy, or how there are, they're going in and using their food stamps to buy all kinds of sorts of snacks and unhealthy things for themselves and for their children and their families. Or, so that's that part here on the left side of the screen with individual responsibility. The other way to tell the story is to tell the systemic reason and the barriers why that is.
Finally tonight, in many cities across the country, there's something that's especially hard to find: a supermarket selling fresh food. And experts say these so-called food deserts are a serious health issue. In Chicago, one innovative idea is making a difference. We get our report tonight from NBC's John Yang.
In this gritty neighborhood on Chicago's west side, fresh fruits and vegetables take the bus. What'd you get today?
I got green.
Can you show us?
Corn.
Oh, wow, look at those greens.
I got honeydew melons and green tomatoes.
I got bananas and corn.
This retired Chicago Transit bus stops here once a week. A produce market on wheels selling items often hard to come by in urban neighborhoods like this one across the country. Liquor stores and convenience stores dot the streets selling processed foods that may not provide the healthiest of diets.
What you can't find is an affordable quality set of fruits and vegetables in these communities on a 365-day basis.
Supermarkets are miles away. Studies estimate that 31 million Americans live in these so-called food deserts.
Residents of
So there are clear systemic barriers here, and that's the availability of food in general. And you can imagine how this could, again, just have easily been told as a problem of like why individuals are responsible for not buying healthy food in general. And indeed, the research show that just an exclusive focus on stories like one person's particular bad problem or hard times, such as let's say it's a story about eviction. No matter how tragic, some people will think, well, this person should just have paid their rent on time or something like that. And unfortunately, if we focus too much on the individual story, we kind of run the risk of reinforcing a belief that people should solve all their problems on their own without any kind of support. So that, again, being on the left-hand side of our belief system and completely overlooking the policies in place, the systemic barriers that are in place that ultimately made it harder for people to succeed and avoid these types of problems. I'm not saying that we should stop using, the people that you help and serve in your ways of communicating, but I want to highlight why it's important to not just focus on them, or when you're telling their stories and the things that they have gone through, make sure to highlight the systemic barriers that they have faced along the way. Which leads us to the fourth point. It's promoting positive solutions. And it's just not enough to tell people what the problem is. This speech is not called "I have a problem." So we need to offer solutions. And it's especially because people have come to, it's hard for people when they have all the problems on their own. The phrase being, people have, 99 problems and they definitely don't want yours. So a lot of people are struggling with compassion fatigue, where, you see a bunch of social problems and, they're just piling on and they can become impossible to solve. And the counter is really to emphasize solutions. You have to be for something and not just against fending off harms and threats in general. And we want to make people feel like they can be doing something about the problem that we represent, that we present to them. And we want to make sure that they feel like they can be a part of that. So in the same way that we want to highlight the systemic story, we also need to offer systemic solutions to that, or solutions in general. So now we know a few principles about communicating in general. Let's turn to civil legal aid specifically. And I want to start with a few challenges that we've been seeing across the country. And there are a few major points that we need to address. The first is the idea of the problem, of the civil justice system in general, of the kind of prejudice or the frames that are already in people's minds when they hear the term lawyer, when they hear the term courts, anything like that. Unfortunately, one of the first things that happens when you mention the civil justice system is this. You probably are more familiar than even I am with the idea of frivolous lawsuits and the language around tort reform that kind of came up in the 90s. So people have this idea, of course, that our courts are kind of clogged, and that there are too many lawsuits in general, and people are suing each other through, over disputes between neighbors. The second part is that people don't really understand what it is legal aid providers do. And I imagine that many of you can kind of nod your heads and know exactly what this legal aid attorney from Indiana is talking about. And then there's the whole systemic part. So Justice Sotomayor, as she says here, there's just not a very good idea of what exactly lawyers and what exactly the courts do. Or to the extent there is, there are certainly problems with that. This relates to how people see their problems. This is from a study from Rebecca Sandiford that she did back in 2014 on behalf of the American Bar Foundation. And as you can see here, the main problem why people don't seek out legal help or legal advice in general is that most people, or close to a majority of people, just don't see their problems as legal in nature. And this is both a good thing and a bad thing. Of course, a bad thing because we want people to know that there's help with their problems. It's also a major opportunity for us as a community to define and to some extent reframe exactly what it is lawyers do and what type of problems that they are helping people with. And this relates to another systemic problem that we have. It is the lack of recognition exactly about what it is you do, but also just the value of legal help and lawyers in general. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, I went through this process on my own. I had no idea what it was. I had the same, kind of ideas of what lawyers did and what they didn't do. And most of them came back from my time watching Ally McBeal on television. And this idea of what types of cases they are. And it's usually a bunch of kooky people with all kinds of various kooky problems as well. And as you can see here, research done by Pew, unfortunately, lawyers are ranked even lower than business executives and even journalists who are facing their own problems right now. And this is not to discourage you in any kind of sense. It's to highlight that there's some work to be done, but also that it needs to be done, and it needs to be done exactly because of this. And if there are nobody out there who's willing to speak of the value that lawyers provide in general, this is something that we need to do, or that we need to take a stand on. Then the problem becomes is how we talk about the work, and this is something that we are contributing to as a community as well, and again that we're seeing across the country. And it's known as the curse of knowledge. And you can probably remember before maybe you went to law school and didn't know a whole lot about the law, and every expert and person in general who does a certain craft for a living will get caught up in talking shop. And this happens to me for sure when I give advice about media. I'll start, throwing out terms like nut grafts and B-roll and asset development and the 80-20 principles and things like that you have. And that's just not a very helpful way to talk about your work. And I want to play you an interview with Laura Tuggle. She is the executive director at Southeast Louisiana Legal Services. And this is from an interview that we set up for her with NPR. And I want you to listen and see if you can figure out why I chose this particular clip. And I need to mention before that Laura is as good as anybody right now in terms of talking about civil legal aid and singling out why her organization is really important and the work that they do is really important. But I want to just play this clip to say that this is sometimes you could just get caught up in the curse of knowledge.
You said you're seeing problems involving home ownership questions and who the heir might be. Explain what that is.
When somebody passes away, a lot of families just informally leave property to the rest of their family members without legally going to court to have it determined who is placed into possession. But whenever there's a flood or a hurricane, post-disaster, having that clear title is usually an eligibility threshold requirement for FEMA assistance.
So if you can't prove that you legally own the house, you might not be able to get the federal funds necessary to repair the house.
Right. It always takes a non-lawyer to make it make sense to regular people.
Right. Legalese is a major part of trying when you try to communicate with people. That sometimes you just really need to pull back and say, this is exactly what's happening from the person who's getting the help's perspective. And by the way, while we're at it, that term, a non-lawyer, I just really want to emphasize that I think people should stop using it, mainly because I don't really know any other profession where people are talking about people in that kind of exclusionary way. Like you're not expecting to go into an auto repair shop and then if you need your car fixed, they're not going to say, well, you're just a non-mechanic and I can't really help you out with that. Or you don't hear doctors saying, well, you're a non-doctor, so this type of disease, and that I'm using all these Latin kind of phrases, of course, isn't something you can kind of relate to. So please drop the term non-lawyer. So let's move into the 2017 messaging research. And we'll do this. We'll go through the research first, and then we'll go through a couple of examples and how you can apply it. And we'll also mention a few examples of how you can combat all these challenges that we have already identified in civil legal aid messaging in general, and how you can kind of combine that with those principles of communication that we have talked about. So the research we're going to talk about today is done by Selena Lake and Anachenko Osorio. And Selena Lake is one of the premier pollsters in the country. And she's done a bunch of research for us on our behalf in the past as well. And Anachenko Osorio, in the same way, she is a cognitive linguist. Maybe some of you have heard about George Lakoff, who kind of pioneered this work a decade or two ago. Not comes from the same kind of traditions. So we'll cover some of the key findings and takeaways. And at the end of the session, I'll show you where you could find all of this research, how it's available to you, and you can even find an audio file of Selena and Anat presenting the entire research at a conference session last year. But I want to pull out the highlights of it because it's an entire session in itself if you were to really go through it and work our way through all the results and details of it. So we looked at 800 likely voters for this midterm election. We wanted to talk to them about the civil justice system in general and about civil legal aid in general. And we also surveyed 278 activists about these very same things. And maybe some of you on the webinar did actually participate in this. And if you did, thank you. That was incredibly helpful to us. I want to talk a bit about what it means by the base persuadables and opposition that we've talked about, because this is not a usual way of dividing a sample of voters on. We have divided people based on their reaction or their support for civil justice reform in general. And the reason we're doing this is because let me pull back a bit. First, there's our base. So people who strongly support the idea of increasing state funding to build a civil justice system that allows people the effective assistance they need to solve all their problems. So these are the people that vehemently agree with what it is that we were trying to do here. Then there's the opposition, who is the exact opposite of that. So they do not support that idea at all. They think that that funding for civil legal aid is better spent elsewhere. The idea behind this is that we have 25% of people who are in opposition to this cause, and you are never going to get them to agree with you. We just have to acknowledge that there are a certain set of the population that no matter what kind of arguments, no matter what kind of messaging we use, they're not going to agree with us. We don't want them to agree with us, because if we use a message that they agree with, but they hold that core belief that they're not supportive of legal aid in general, we've done something wrong, and that we're not really selling, or they're hearing something else in what we really mean. So the reason why we've done and defined people like this is because we want to figure out exactly who or how many were in opposition to that very basic argument. Now, there are some caveats to this. They break down on age demographics and on partisan lines. I don't think it'll be a surprise to anybody that most of the base here tend to be more Democratic, and the opposition tend to be more Republican. The opposition tends to be white as well, whereas the base is more racially diverse. But it doesn't mean that that is everybody there. It just means that the majority of people of our base tends to be one way or the other. Now, as we've seen in past research as well, the idea of legal aid is largely invisible, at least to the broader American public. And I want to make a caveat here that in Washington State, I think you've done a fabulous job of turning that around. There are still more work to be done, though. And what we can tell, too, is that people are really supportive as soon as they get to learn about the issue. And that's a good thing. We're not up against like enormous challenge that other issues, or people who are working on other issues, where when they learn more about it, they get a bit more confused or a bit more iffy or more conflicted about their support or not. So this is an opportunity for us to say the more people engage and hear about this, the more supportive they tend to become. So it's not necessarily a problem of persuading people, it's more a problem of making the issue salient to them. Now, here are a couple of highlights from the 2017 messaging research. And I'll give you just 30 seconds to read this. So as you can see, in general, we asked, who do you think in general have the hardest time or face the most difficulty obtaining legal help? And it's mainly people who are low income, mainly people who are living in rural areas. and those struggling to make ends meet. And that will tell you a lot about how to message that, or how to make an argument to people in general by tapping into a certain group that people agree with should have this help. In general, voters really want civil justice reform. They strongly support this wide range of services to enable everybody to get access to information and any kind of effective assistance when they need it, and in a form that they could somewhat use. The numbers are kind of staggering here. 50% wanted to reform the civil justice system in general, whereas around 20% wanted to keep it the same. So this is certainly an issue we can talk about, because voters at least really do want change. This is true too in terms of who people think should have access to the civil justice system in general. This is true whether we also say legal representation or legal help. Majority of voters still think that it is important to make sure people have access to that. Then we tested what values really resonated with voters, and these are the two that were just immediately rose to the top. In fact, that phrase, equal justice under the law is a right, not a privilege, was supported by 82% of voters, 8 out of 10 people, which in terms of polling across different issues is perhaps the closest thing you can come to something that everybody agrees on. It's really remarkable and cuts across partisan lines in a way that is not true of most issues these days. And as you can see here, they also support this wider range of services, which includes the idea. So it's not just the idea of a lawyer per se. They also, want better forms, online help, self-help centers, online technology, things that make sense for certain people to have. And even something that is, people want increased state funding. And this is remarkable because even when we tested this to say, would you want to increase state funding if it meant that your taxes went up, a majority of voters still believe that to be true. And in a kind of an era where everybody's like really tax sensitive, that is again quite remarkable, and something that we shouldn't be shy away from, because again, we have the majority of people, at least the voters, on our side. And again, this means that our problem is not really one of persuasion. We certainly need to persuade people to come to our side, but the main thing is really to create this sense of urgency about the problem, and it is to create intensity among people so that more people this will actually be something that drives people to any type of political action, or that drive lawmakers into making concrete policy. So we've arrived at the place where we can talk about how we should talk about the work. And we tested a bunch of different messages through what's known as dial surveys. And here's how that works. You may have seen it during a debate. So people will hear a message and they will turn a dial up or down depending on whether they like it or not. And I want to play the 3 messages that tested the best. And the reason why I wanted to introduce you to base, opposition, and persuadables is because we have divided those 3 into distinct lines. And I'll show you. I promise you, it will all make sense here. But just so you know, there are a bunch of different lines you'll see when it comes to this message.
Whether it's a wrongful foreclosure or eviction, debt collection by a predatory lender, or a child custody hearing, finding yourself in court can be terrifying. Every document is fine print legal jargon that might as well be a foreign language. In response, one city launched a Court Navigators program, which trains specialists to provide simplified legal help. Through one-on-one support, navigators help people access information, know their rights, understand what's happening, and file papers correctly. They arrange for available services, including interpreters if necessary, and explain what to expect in the courtroom, providing real support. Navigators are allowed to accompany people into the courtroom and may respond to factual questions the judge directs to them. By expanding the legal assistance available, this approach is already producing significantly faster and better results, and at a savings. States and cities should follow this lead, ensuring greater access to justice for all.
So, you can tell a couple of things about this message. And you'll see that it tests incredibly well, even among the opposition. The only point where it really went down was around here when they talk about interpreters if necessary. And I think this mainly ties into the anti-immigrant sentiment that you might see among among the opposition as well. That's kind of conflated in that. You can see the phrase "finding yourself in court can be terrifying" is where the dials start going up, and as well as when you present the solution, like the Court Navigators program training specialists to provide simplified legal help. That's when the dials will start going up as well. And the whole, even though we saw earlier that people certainly want to increase funding, and we've seen in research that they want to increase funding even though it's their tax dollars that that will go to it, and they will personally pay more in taxes. The cost savings argument there at the end is also just very effective to people. Now let's look at this next one.
Civil legal aid lawyers help ordinary people get a fair chance against big corporations, institutions, even the government that have armies of lawyers at their command. Yet some powerful politicians are only too happy to gut funding for civil legal aid. Too many times, people are forced to live with their rights trampled and their economic livelihoods destroyed because they cannot afford legal advice and help. For decades, legal aid groups have been a driving force, making meaningful change in millions of Americans' lives. But there's not enough help to go around. Now the same Americans are shut out of the justice system, including seniors, people with disabilities, veterans, and regular working families. It's time we level the playing field and ensure all Americans, no matter how much or how little money you have equal justice under the law.
So you saw the 3 dials there as well. I'll show you the thing about this is the voters in general that goes there. And as you can see with this thing that's highlighted here, there are a lot of things going on here. Particularly, I want to highlight that when you start talking about people who are shut out and the idea of leveling the playing field, that's when people are really, or most people are starting to warm up to this message in general. You can also see that there's a lot going on when you're talking about how civil legal aid lawyers help ordinary people. That's very popular when it starts to go up. And you see people dial down when they start talking about a particular set of powerful politicians. And I think this goes into the whole populist moment that we're living through as well. And it's sometimes what happens when these dials too is that as soon as people hear a certain word that they're triggered by, they will automatically dial a bit down. This is something we're seeing, that as soon as in some dials, as soon as you mention domestic violence survivors, people will dial down at the beginning just because they have a strong reaction to and don't like domestic violence in general, even though the message is really supportive of policies that will help survivors like that. So notice that sometimes those small swings can be just the result of the way these surveys are conducted, and not necessarily that that people are not particularly supportive of certain groups that we highlight in this research. Now, the last one.
In our civil justice system, in 3 out of 4 cases, at least one party is there without legal help. These are ordinary Americans who need, but cannot get, legal support, while confronting challenges that few of us could handle on our own. Families facing the loss of a home due to job layoff or medical catastrophe. Veterans and military families denied hard-earned benefits. Victims of domestic violence trapped without the resources to safely leave their abusers, and many more. Facing civil legal matters like these without assistance is like having a serious medical condition and being forced to treat it yourself. Many of these people risk life-changing consequences because they can't afford to pay a lawyer. We need to ensure all Americans can protect their rights and count on fairness in the civil justice system.
So as you can see, this message certainly has a longer wind-up, because we're spending a lot of time in general of talking about the problem, and that's where you could see, maybe a third into the message that is kind of, it rises a bit and then it kind of levels off, and then when it really takes off is at the end, when they start talking again about the values and making sure that all Americans can protect their rights, count on fairness of the civil justice system in general. And these are and here are just a few of the things that's happening in the message where there are some kind of movement. And again, I just want to point out that the voters in particular there at the end really like the idea of protecting their rights, count on fairness, and there is a certain increase in how people feel about this message when they talk about particular groups, and that includes, not surprisingly, veterans and military families who are being denied hard-earned benefits in general. So, a few things that we've learned through all of this research. And the first thing here is exactly that you need to use language that talks about real life experiences. They're way more engaging. And we need to be explicit about framing the issues and the problems legal aid addresses as being, legal in nature. We need to make sure that people have a real understanding exactly about what it is that legal aid lawyers do. And we can do this by bringing the courtroom into the frame. So courtrooms have this, prominent place on television, but our advocacy for legal aid often kind of puts that in the background. So it's about using terms like having your day in court and appearing before a judge. You can kind of activate this very familiar frame and help people see that a dispute with a landlord or getting hounded by a bill collector or something is actually a legal problem that has a potential legal solution. I also want to highlight something that, like a small thing that we did realize after we played these messages. It's way more important to, first of all, use a singular, meaning that instead of veterans, if you say a veteran, or families, you say a family. And the theory there is because if we talk about veterans as a group, it's harder to connect to, whereas if you mention a veteran to somebody, people's minds will automatically start to think about people in their own lives who maybe are a veteran. That's also why when you talk about real life experiences, that's also why, as you may have noticed in the previous masters, that we talked about a veteran denied hard-earned benefits. So it's not just evoking them as a group. And it's the same way that it's not as effective to say low-income people as it is to say people struggling to make ends meet or people who have a hard time paying their bills. Because that whole experience, or people who need to choose between, paying the electric bill or putting food on the table, those kinds of real-life experiences are the type of things that people respond much better to. And of course, it's easier to empathize with because they may know the experience from their own lives, or they may know it from somebody, their loved ones. And the second thing we realized is that a lot of language is passive, meaning that we kind of obscure the origin of problems, meaning that legal aid, let's say it's legal aid funding has been decimated in the past couple of years. There's no real actor behind that. And when we don't make clear that people do things, what we suggest there is that harms just befall on people, and that they just fall out of the sky, and that problems and solutions in the same way should fall out of the sky too. The idea, you need to put actors in your story. You need to make sure that people know who exactly is driving those decisions. And that means you have to talk about who is actually behind this, and you have to name them. And maybe it's the idea of, let's say it's the idea of funding. We have a way of saying that legal aid programs have to turn away at least one case for every one they take, which tend to do two things. First of all, it has just happened. There's no driving force or reason why that's happening. It also risks that people fill in the blanks of their own and think, oh, are they turning people away just because, maybe it's their fault that they're turning people away. So an example is, it's way better to say politicians who deny funding for civil legal aid force us to turn away half of the eligible people or half of the people who need our help. And this is true too of the magic word that has certainly been percolated a while in our community, and that we just need to eradicate. And that's the idea of the justice gap. And I know that, that it's something that's been out there for a while, and I know the new LSC report from last year is titled "The Justice Gap," and and we should use the contents of that report for sure. But the whole idea of the justice gap metaphor is just bad, exactly for a couple of reasons. But first of all, because it is a passive. Like, a gap is something that is just came out of nowhere. You have no idea of who made it, why it came to be, and consequently, people don't really know, how, or cognitively don't know or don't see a human solution to the actual problem. This is true like across every domain that this has been tested on. So the education gap, the income gap, every time this kind of gap language is introduced, it really it just doesn't test well, or people don't really understand it. We need to talk about exactly what it is you do that is unique, and why your work is kind of different from other organizations. So you all have a very unique way of solving a problem, and that is by legal representation, mainly. And you're not any other nonprofit. Maybe you're part of the coalitions, of course, who work on housing or domestic violence or what have you, but you have a fairly unique way of trying to solve that problem, which is through legal help. And you need to make sure that that is a part of the conversation. And let me show you one way of doing that. So if you remember Laura Toggle from earlier in the webinar, here is a recent interview that she did just last week. And I want you to read through this and see how the value of what they do and the idea of legal help is very much linked to a certain problem, which here is homeless veterans. So as you can see here, she does a great job in terms of saying how legal help is essential, and she also puts in the actors. So it's the attorneys who are helping to fight evictions and prevent the loss of their housing. And so she links these attorneys and the idea of legal help with these very real life experiences and problems that people will hopefully will start to connect those dots. Another example that we saw recently was an op-ed by a staff attorney in Chicago. And what she does well in this thing is, again, to link a very tragic event to the idea of how a lawyer might be able to solve it, which again addresses the idea from back when, from the Pew research that talked about how lawyers aren't necessarily seen by that many people as having like a great societal resource. So this is what she wrote. So what she does really well here is to talk about this woman Lucretia Roby's problem in a court frame. She also talks about how there's this dearth of legal assistance available to people, and I'll end with this quote at the end of the article, and it is, "In a few weeks, I will enter documents in the divorce case verifying that Lakeisha is deceased, and I will close her file. But today, I'm wondering if Lakeisha and others like her would still be alive if they had been able to get a free attorney when she first needed one." So that's a very explicit way of talking about exactly how attorneys could help. Now, I realize that this was certainly a lot. I'll show you that on our website, voicesforciviljustice.org, we have, this is the front page, and if you want to find this messaging and go a bit into the weeds of with these things, this is where you could find it. If you click on that link, this is what it would look like. As you can tell, there's a blog post that kind of goes through, like I went through in this session, what the highlights are. You can find the full PDF of the survey and what it found. There's that audio link there in the middle, where you can find Celinda and Anat presenting these findings from last year. We also have the 3 other pieces of research that we've conducted over the years, and the one from 2013 is research that we did in general on civil legal aid that's very similar to the ones that we just did. We've also done research with 2 other audiences in mind, and the first one being lawyers in general, and the second one being people in the philanthropic community. And there's certainly a lot of overlap there, and it's very much some of the lessons are the same, but there are a few differences, and it goes back to considering your audience as being a very important thing to do when you're messaging in general. I want to just end on a note that what we're helping with in Washington right now, and across the country, is that we are trying to set up these state level hubs or create that state level capacity for communications in general. So there's a certain strategy that has been set for Washington that revolved around the funding campaign. There's a certain plan that has been made, and there are certain staff devoted to this very effort. And we've been trying to help out with that, and that's exactly one of the reasons why you're here at the webinar today. Outside of that, we want to be there to help out. We're not just connected to you because we're not connected through the HJ Commission, you are absolutely welcome to either give us a call or sign up to the network in general. If you have any questions around all of this or any of this communications, media work, or messaging in general, we are here. We can certainly more than happy to have a conversation about any of the things that or challenges that you might be seeing on a daily basis. Now, lastly, I think I want to open it up for questions. And what I did see along the way is that we've had some problems in the chat of taking the exact questions. So let me just put on a webcam here in general. And if you, okay, I see here there are all these things. Okay, any question, or rather, let's open it up for questions here to see what might have come up along the way. Okay, Noah asks, what do you recommend in lieu of the justice gap? The gap was a problem because that it kind of implied that this just happened overnight. So any kind of word that has to do or that kind of connotes something that humans have built, that could be a word like a barrier or something, or it could be something that that kind of talks about, again, kind of the systemic ways in which we're failing people. But the main word is, another thing is to try to talk about people being excluded from justice. And that kind of language has the effect too that people just really don't like the idea of people being excluded for somebody. It also allows you, or at least opens something up to say who it is who is doing the exclusion in general. So you could, if it's let's say it's a housing issue, you could say that landlords are excluding people from justice, or people are facing these exclusions, or like renters across the country are facing these exclusions from justice because of the way that certain policy is set up, or a certain landlord certain landlords are doing things. So those are the two things that immediately come to mind there. Okay. I finally found you can, if you have any questions other than that, you can certainly raise your hand here. I see something from Charlie earlier. I don't know if that's still the case. And of course the chat box is still open. I don't see a whole lot of questions coming in here. Jay, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to it, or a question that this kind of points up. Oh, here's one from Diana. Are there any resources for how to respond to a person who appears to be opposed to rights for low-income people? Something like a good rebuttal, or how not to turn them off? Yeah. I think there are two parts to that question. The first is because it kind of goes back to we talked about in the beginning that people have these two views of the world simultaneously, and activating one thing over the other certainly helps in terms of how people respond to you, and talking about, again, experiences that the person you're talking to can relate to. So if you talk about low-income people in a way that says, yeah, these are the types of things that they're just trying to do. They're just trying to, put their kids through school and feed their families, and kind of talk about their anxieties. You can also make them more human by talking about, a certain client that maybe has, like what are their dreams and their hopes and aspirations and things that make them human, like all the quirky details. Instead of talking about spending 80% of the time talking about the legal problem they're facing and how you ultimately were able to resolve it. It's always good to inoculate against it by talking about how, yeah, this is a person who had this problem. Let's say it was with a debt collector, and then spend the rest of the time pretty much talking about all the different things that problem prevented that person from doing. And then there's the other thing about how not to turn them off. It's a funny thing. You will encounter at least, maybe it's 15%, maybe it's 25% of people who you will never get to agree with you. You will never get them to agree with you. And I would argue you actually need to turn them off, because if you're saying something that they're sort of agreeing with, but their core value is that they just don't believe that poor people should have the same rights, you're not having the most energizing and effective message in the first place. And you actually want them to be turned off, because those are people, I would argue at least, that has a very wrong and extreme way of viewing the world. And the more they are out there with their rather extreme messages, the more they're kind of turning off the people in the middle, the persuadables in the middle, that we need to come to our side. Jennifer asks, is there any messaging along issues of racism, equity, and social justice that you can share, or general thoughts? The Opportunity Agenda, one of our partners, did have helped us out with some of these presentations, and has this wonderful tool called VPSA that we model a lot of our messaging on in general, which stands for Value, Problem, Solution, Action. They have done a lot of messaging research around these particular issues, and I'm happy to, with a follow-up email, just kind of share what they have. The other thing is just to Google the Opportunity Agenda, and you can find all of their resources and how to talk about those issues in particular. And Charlie asks, did the message testing show that like naming human actors or causing problems or barriers to calling out systems is helpful too? Yeah, I mean, it did. There are, I'd have to go back and dive into the research we did a couple of years ago, because that was qualitative in nature, meaning that was focus group material, and a much more going back and forth, and not this was quantitative, so it asked a lot of questions that people had a few different answers to, and didn't dive as much into like what was behind moving people. And I think the main thing to take away from that, and I'm happy to follow up with you, Charlie, offline afterwards. The main thing to take away from that is, yeah, you should absolutely name the people who are causing these problems, and if that somehow is a system, that's helpful, but only to the extent that you also mention the people who are behind the system. If you just mention that a system is corrupt, or or kind of what it does or how it is bad at functioning. If you're not mentioning the people behind it, it's hard for it's just hard for people in general to believe that they can change it as well. I think I actually did a reversal there of my actual answer. Let me rephrase that charter to say, calling out systems is only helpful if you at the same time calling out the people who are causing the problems or causing the system or are a part of the system that makes it run unjustly or in an unfair way. Okay, we still have technically 10 minutes left, but I don't want to belabor any points. And of course, there are a lot of takeaways. And Jay asks if you can jump into a question. Yes, please.
So Soren, you showed us that one of the messaging takeaways from the research is to use language rooted in real life experiences so that people can connect with it. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, what you all have seen as more effective, adjusting an organization's messaging to focus on, those real life experiences and language that connects with people, and maybe they're not mutually exclusive, they probably aren't, or working with people that have received services, so working with clients to train them to tell their own story.
Yeah. It's Do you have any specific thing you want me to jump in on there, or anything you're thinking?
I mean, it's a little bit of a leading question because I think we're going to try to address that in the next webinar to some extent. But I'm just wondering if you've seen any sort of response from different programs around the country about like, oh, it was so much more effective that we worked with this client and had them share their story with this legislator or with this reporter or at our event versus we've just trained our staff to talk about the work differently. And again, I know they're not mutually exclusive, but if you've seen that kind of feedback or response from different programs around the country.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I as much as I had like the caveat in the middle of the training that that just highlighting one story sometimes run the risk of people wanting to fix that person instead of wanting to fix the problem. I mean, that personal stories is the best way of connecting with people in general. And what you'll see, whether it is on the state level or on the federal level, or whether talking to lawmakers or talking to somebody at a grocery store, really personal stories and how it's affected people are exactly the right way to go. And you want to empower people to tell their own stories. You definitely want to do that, and you want to highlight how your work has changed the lives of people in your community. I think that's absolutely essential to the work that you're doing. And if any of you have any want more information on that or want more details, we have that information readily available. We've also helped in the past, both with sharing advocate stories and drafting those as op-eds or trying to pitch them to local reporters. We've also, to a smaller extent, but something that we're of course open to, is to connect with clients who want to tell their stories and help them draft speeches or op-eds or any kind of outward-facing messaging or communications in general. Okay. I do not see any more questions. We're 7 minutes out. So Jay, I don't know, do you have any closing remarks?
I just want to say thanks again, Soren. We really appreciate your help and Voice's help, and you guys have been such a great partner. And I want to remind people that the next webinar in this series is May 23rd. Again, it's also from noon to 1:30, and we're going to be putting together a webinar that focuses on how to effectively share client stories. You'll see a follow-up email from Bonnie in the next day or so with a short survey, feedback survey about this webinar, and just some more information about kind of next steps.
Sorry, we will make all the material available to you as well. And well, thanks everybody, and hope to hear from you. And I'm just again very thankful being able to present here, and thank you for all you do.